Welcome to Unholy Inquiry, where each tale leads you deeper into a labyrinth of mystery waiting to be uncovered. This time, join us as we delve into Hercule Poirot and One Sip, One Death, a fan-crafted story that pays homage to the genius and sophistication of Agatha Christie's iconic detective, Hercule Poirot. We are thrilled to have you with us on this captivating journey. Share your thoughts, let us know where you're tuning in from, and if you spot any details we missed, your feedback is invaluable. Together, let's continue to shape even more thrilling enigmas. Chapter 1. The Toast That Killed. The champagne flutes gleamed like daggers in the candlelight. A scream shattered the polite laughter just as the crystal glasses touched. One guest dropped dead before her toast had cooled on her lips. Poirot did not blink. "Murder," he said, so softly that only the clinking ice in the butler's tray replied. It had been a dinner of elegance and ego hosted in the drawing room of the sprawling Belfort Manor, an estate draped in French tapestries, storm-lit windows, and the scent of expensive secrets. The rain whipped against the glass like a warning. From the moment Poirot had arrived, by special invitation no less, he had felt it, the tension that danced just beneath the silverware. Lady Helena Rothbourne had spared no luxury for her husband's retirement gala. The guests had arrived in gloved hands and false smiles, a parade of old money, faded glamour, and long-held grudges. Her husband, General Alistair Rothbourne, had once commanded armies. Tonight, he commanded the attention of traitors. But it was not he who fell. No, it was Celeste Ward. Her body arched back in her chair like a string pulled too tight. Her champagne flute dropped from her fingers and shattered at her heels. One sip, one breath, one death. Eyes wide, mouth frozen mid-smile. By the time the maid screamed, the poison had already finished its whispering. Poirot, who had not yet lifted his glass, set it down gently and stood. "Mes amis," he began, scanning the shocked, stammering faces. "This evening, we shall not require dessert." He moved to the body. No bruising, no sign of struggle. Nothing inhaled. He touched the rim of her flute with a silk kerchief. "Just the champagne, yes. But human nature, it never changes. Someone always drinks first. Someone always watches." General Rothbourne's weathered face was pale, but his hands were steady. He barked orders to the staff, demanded a doctor. Poirot observed how he did not kneel beside Celeste. Nor did he look at his wife, only at the maid, Esme, who stood trembling with a tray full of untouched glasses. Poirot murmured, "Curious." From the guests, 3 stood out immediately. First, Felix Marlowe, the playwright, flamboyant and cruelly observant, who'd once been Celeste's lover. He was already pacing, hand to temple, muttering about a curse and unfinished letters. Second, Dr. Miriam Hawthorne, the elegant physician whose cold manner disguised an intensity Poirot had seen only in battlefield surgeons and lonely aristocrats. She had argued with Celeste not 2 hours before, in hushed tones in the conservatory. Third, Emmett Lee, the Rothbournes' financial advisor, quiet, mouse-like, perpetually adjusting his cuffs. He had toasted with his left hand. An oddity Poirot noted and filed away. Poirot spoke quietly to the butler, who was pale but professional. "Each guest brought a gift, n'est-ce pas? Show me Celeste's." The gift was a book, old, leather-bound, too worn for such an occasion. Inside the front cover, pressed like a secret, was a torn theatre ticket stub dated 5 years ago. Poirot tapped it. "What do you hide, Mademoiselle Ward?" Act 2 began with the house sealed, the telephone lines mysteriously cut, though Poirot suspected a blade had done the job. The storm raged. The guests were restless. Someone suggested sleeping arrangements. Poirot ignored them. In the drawing room, Poirot gathered the guests near the grand piano. He did not raise his voice. He did not accuse. He simply asked, "Who poured the champagne?" Esme the maid stuttered. I arranged them, but the bottles were already open. I didn't pour." She looked at Felix. He offered to help. "I topped one glass," Felix interrupted, eyes darting. "She, Celeste, asked me to, said she wanted mine. It was a joke." Poirot smiled tightly. Was it? Celeste had chosen her own glass. The wrong one. Or the right one. "Poirot, surely you don't suspect me," Felix said too quickly. Poirot tilted his head. "Murder is not theatre, Monsieur Marlowe. But you do know your entrances." He turned to Dr. Hawthorne. "And you?" "You argued with the victim." Miriam met his gaze, unflinching. Celeste was meddling in things she didn't understand. That's not a crime. Poirot arched a brow. "Sometimes it is." "Such as?" she asked. He said nothing, only watched her as the storm outside cracked like a gavel. Later, Poirot wandered alone into the library. There, on the floor beside a carved chair, he found a smear of lipstick, not Celeste's shade, and a broken cufflink with the initials E.L. Emmett Lee. In the study, Poirot found Emmett rifling through drawers. Poirot cleared his throat. "Looking for a motive, Monsieur Lee?" Emmett jumped. "No, I was looking for my briefcase. I must have left it." Poirot's eyes narrowed. "You do not carry one. Your coat pocket suffices, unless you carry secrets." Emmett paled. Poirot returned to the drawing room and stared at the champagne flutes still standing. He counted them. One short. "Ah," he whispered, "the missing glass. It was found later, in the fireplace, shattered, burnt edges, too deliberate. Someone wanted that glass erased." Poirot gathered the guests once more. "You have all lied to me." Gasps, murmurs. Poirot held up the burnt stem. "But the fire does not lie. The poison was not meant for Celeste Ward. It was meant for Lady Rothbourne." Helena staggered. "What? No, surely not." Poirot looked directly at the general. "But someone switched glasses, intentionally or not." General Rothbourne's mouth was a tight line. Poirot turned to Felix. "You poured for Celeste, but she swapped it, didn't she?" Felix looked confused, then horrified. "She said she preferred mine. Took mine. Poirot nodded. "Yes, and she died for it." He turned to Miriam. "You argued because Celeste uncovered your affair with Lady Rothbourne." Silence. Then Helena stood. "That's absurd." But Poirot's voice was steel. "No. She found out, threatened to expose it, so you planned to silence her." Miriam's voice was low. "I didn't poison anyone." "No," Poirot agreed. "You did not. But you told someone who would." The final twist came as Poirot walked to Emmett. "Your cufflink, monsieur. And your investment records. Celeste discovered your theft." Emmett's voice cracked. I thought—" "You poisoned the glass marked for Lady Rothbourne," Poirot said, "because she was closing in. But your panic killed someone else." Poirot's voice dropped. "Celeste drank your guilt." Emmett fell to his knees. "I didn't mean—" Poirot bowed his head. "Ah, but intention does not unmake the dead." The constables arrived before dawn. The storm passed, but But the mood in Belfort Manor did not. Poirot stood alone in the great hall, the echoes of the night curling like smoke around him. He whispered, "It is the smallest choice, a sip, a seat, a switch, that alters the course of fate." Then softer still, to no one. "The truth, mon ami, is not always what brings peace. Sometimes it only brings justice." The wind howled through the empty glass, where once there had been champagne, and a life. Chapter 2. She sipped, he smiled. The glass touched her lips, and for a heartbeat, the world stopped. A fire crackled in the hearth, untouched roast duck sat cooling on the silver platters, and every eye watched as Helena Rothbourne lifted the rim to her mouth. She sipped, just once, then lowered the glass and smiled faintly. But across the room, Emmett Lee exhaled, too slowly. His smile bloomed just a second too soon, and Hercule Poirot saw it. He always did. Mon Dieu, Poirot thought, narrowing his eyes behind the gentle steam of his tea. There are smiles that speak joy, and those that confess murder. The storm outside had not ceased since Celeste's sudden death the evening before. Thunder curled around the manor like a predator circling its prey. The smell of ozone and old wood seeped into every curtain, every velvet-lined chair. Belfort Manor, once a fortress of reputation, was beginning to rot from within. And the rot, Poirot was certain, began with the truth someone refused to tell. Helena sat now with a strange composure. She had insisted on continuing breakfast. A strange, almost defiant gesture from a woman who had nearly sipped her own death the night before. Poirot noticed the way her fingers rested near the glass, protective, yet fearful. She did not sip again. Her husband, General Rothbourne, sat rigid beside her, staring forward like a man reviewing battle formations. Not once did he look at his wife. But he did glance, precisely twice, at Dr. Miriam Hawthorne, who sat across from them, unusually quiet, eyes hidden behind round spectacles. Poirot was not interested in breakfast. He was interested in the angle of the smile Emmett Lee gave when Helena drank. He had seen that expression before, in courtrooms, in alleyways, in the mirror sometimes, on the faces of killers who believed the worst was over. "Tell me," Poirot said gently, breaking the silence that clung to the table like cobwebs, what were Mademoiselle Ward's final words? Helena's fork paused. She said, "To new beginnings," then drank, then collapsed. Poirot nodded slowly. "And that was meant for you, but you did not drink." "No," she said quietly, "not yet." "A hesitation that saved your life," Poirot said, rising, "or condemned hers." Dr. Hawthorne spoke. "Inspector, surely you don't mean to imply Lady Rothbourne is responsible for her own attempted murder?" Poirot turned. "Doctor, in murder, responsibility is often passed like champagne at a party, clinked and offered with a smile. I do not yet know whose hands poured it, but I know this: someone smiled too soon." He left the dining hall, stepping into the west corridor. Footsteps followed. "Poirot," came the low voice. Felix Marlowe, the playwright. Dressed in a dressing gown too opulent for mourning, he still reeked of last night's whiskey and ego. "You suspect Emmett," he said. Poirot raised a brow. "I suspect many, but I listen before I accuse." Felix smiled darkly. "Celeste told me something before she died. Something about the general. She said, he will destroy Helena for what she's done." "Et alors?" Poirot paused mid-step. "Do you believe the general would kill his wife? For betrayal?" Felix shrugged. or have someone else do it. He has connections. He's ruined men over lesser offenses. Poirot turned to face him fully. Why do you tell me this now? Felix looked away. Because I'm not next. Poirot's eyes narrowed. That is not certainty, Monsieur Marlowe. That is fear. Back in the drawing room, Poirot asked the staff to retrieve the seating chart from the night before. Where each guest sat at the toast, he explained, may tell us who the murderer intended to kill and who merely sat in the wrong chair. The chart revealed something strange. Celeste Ward and Helena Rothbourne had not sat next to each other. But the glasses had been switched, confirmed by Esme, the maid, who remembered Celeste adjusting place cards to feel more comfortable. A polite excuse, or something else. Poirot returned to Helena. Madame, did you and Celeste share secrets? Helena hesitated. She was, close to Felix once. We didn't always see eye to eye. And yet, you allowed her into your home. I had no choice, Alistair insisted. He owed her father a debt from the war. Poirot mused, but perhaps you owed her something greater. Helena stood. What are you implying? Poirot met her eyes. That someone here knows who poured the poison, and someone else knows who it was meant for. Those are not always the same person. He turned and found Emmett waiting in the hallway, sweating despite the chill. You watched her drink, Poirot said. Emmett's eyes widened. You smiled, Poirot continued. Before anyone else had processed her collapse. I was nervous. People who are nervous tremble. They do not grin. I didn't poison anyone. Did you move the glasses? No. Poirot leaned in. But you knew which one was Helena's. Emmett's face collapsed inward. I only told Felix. Ah, Poirot said. Then perhaps it is he who played switcheroo with the fates. The trail returned, as it always did, to motive. Celeste had discovered something. Poirot now believed it had nothing to do with an affair. Instead, it was financial. Helena's charity, a project for war widows, had large amounts of money missing. Celeste had hinted to Emmett the day before her death that she was going to reveal what she knew, that she had found the missing funds flowing into a private account with Helena's name on it. But Poirot also discovered a second account under a pseudonym, M.H. Miriam Hawthorne. A red herring, perhaps, or a collaborator. Poirot summoned Miriam to the study. You received funds, he said, from Lady Rothbourne's charity. Illegally. She did not deny it. She wanted to keep the clinic open, Miriam said. Her husband would never allow it. He thought it was a waste. So you helped her cover the embezzlement. She gave me permission. It was for a good cause. But Celeste knew and was going to expose it. Perhaps to Felix, perhaps to the police. And you think I'd kill to protect Helena? I think, Poirot said, you'd kill to protect what she gave you. A future, a purpose. Miriam's lips parted. I didn't poison her. No, Poirot said gently. You didn't. He returned to the grand hall. All the suspects gathered, silent, weary, and waiting. Poirot stood by the fireplace. The poison was slipped into a single glass. That much is certain. But the question was always, who placed it? And who benefited? He walked slowly to Emmett. You told Felix. Which glass was Helena's? That was your only mistake. Felix paled. No, he shouted. I wouldn't hurt Celeste. I loved her. You did, Poirot said softly. But you also loved the stage, the attention, the drama. When Helena announced she was ending her funding to your theatre, Celeste told you. She was going to help you. Expose Helena, so you acted. Felix's voice broke. I didn't mean for her to drink it. But you poured it, Poirot said. And when Celeste switched glasses, you smiled. Felix dropped to his knees. I only wanted to scare her, to make her sick. I didn't know it would kill her. Poirot turned away. The intention does not erase the consequence. The constables arrived, and Felix was taken. Poirot remained at the window, watching the storm finally clear. Helena stood beside him. Do you think she knew? She asked softly. Poirot nodded once. Yes, I believe she did. She sipped it anyway. Poirot said nothing for a long time. Then she saw him smile. And still, she drank. Sometimes, madame, the heart chooses to see what the mind cannot bear. He turned from the window, his silhouette fading into the dawn. Justice, Poirot whispered to himself, is rarely without sorrow. But it is still justice. Chapter 3. No one saw him pour it. The fire had burned down to embers by the time the whisper reached Poirot's ear. A maid, pale and trembling, had slipped him the note as if it carried death itself. It read only 4 words. No one saw him pour it. He folded the paper with deliberate care and tucked it into his waistcoat pocket. It was not merely a clue, it was a confession, couched in fear. The wind howled beyond the thick glass of Belfort Manor's windows, but inside, a colder storm brewed. Poirot's mind had been ticking like the grandfather clock in the hall, precise, relentless. The hour was just past midnight, yet sleep had fled every room of the house. Poirot paced alone, his patent leather shoes tapping softly across the black and white marble. Somewhere in the manor, a killer moved, unnoticed, unobserved, and perhaps unrepentant. Ah, but the criminal always believes he is unseen, n'est-ce pas? Invisible, untouchable. Poirot smiled faintly. The truth, like the scent of almond in poisoned wine, always lingered longer than the crime. Celeste Ward had died from poison. This was certain. Helena Rothborn had nearly joined her, and the intended victim was still not conclusively known. The wineglass, the seating, the toast, it had all been a theatrical tragedy of movement. One sip, and death changed its target. But there remained a single damning truth. Someone had poured the poison, and no one claimed to have seen it. This is the impossible thing. In a room of 10, with champagne glasses counted and poured by the maid, with the host himself giving a toast, and with conversation whirling, someone had found a moment to slip death into a single glass. A moment so small, so unnoticed, it had passed like smoke through silk. Poirot returned to the dining room, now empty, save for the shadows. The table had not been cleared, he had insisted. The scene was still sacred. The glass Celeste had used now sat on a silver tray, isolated, marked by a chalk ring. He stood over it now, observing the faintest trace of a lip print, the angle of it, the faint powder. He leaned closer. Cherry blossom, he murmured. Japanese, imported, expensive, worn by only one woman here. He turned and walked through the silent hall to find her. Dr. Miriam Hawthorne sat by the library hearth, alone, book untouched in her lap, hands twitching. Her spectacles reflected the firelight. When Poirot entered, she did not look up. You wore the same shade of rouge as the victim, he said calmly. She sighed. We shared a mirror before dinner. It was a moment of civility. But it left more than civility. It left confusion. Miriam's brow furrowed. Two identical glasses, both marked by the same shade of lip rouge, one touched by death, one untouched. It changes things. She finally met his eyes. So the poisoner couldn't tell which was which. Or, Poirot said, softly, knew exactly which was which, and counted on the rest of us not knowing. Outside, thunder cracked. Poirot waited, letting the silence settle. Did you see anyone pour the wine? No, she said, but I saw who didn't. Helena never touched the bottle, nor did Felix, nor Emmett. It was already poured when we entered. Already poured, Poirot repeated. Then someone had access before dinner began, and with that thought, he vanished down the hall like a shadow. At sunrise, he summoned Esme, the maid, again. You set the table, oui? She nodded nervously. You placed the glasses? Yes, sir. All polished, all clean. And who handled the bottle of champagne? She hesitated. The butler, Mr. Kent. He always prepares the drinks. He keeps them chilled. Poirot's eyes narrowed. Mr. Kent, the silent, gliding presence at every social occasion, always 3 steps behind the general, always invisible. Precisely because he was always there, it was time to speak to the ghost. Poirot found Mr. Kent in the cellar, inspecting the wine racks. The man was as polished as his reputation. Sharp lines, white gloves, steel gaze. He bowed slightly when Poirot entered. You supervised the champagne? I prepared the tray, sir. Brought it up just before the bell. And who poured? I did. But under General Rothborn's instruction, he selected the bottle himself. Did he handle the glasses? No. I poured them in the butler's pantry. Alone. Poirot paused. You were alone? Yes. Poirot looked to the tray behind Kent. Clean. Gleaming. Too clean. And yet, Poirot said slowly, no one saw you pour. No one else entered the pantry? Not to my knowledge. Not to your knowledge, Poirot repeated. Not no one did. Curious phrasing. Kent stiffened slightly. I am careful, monsieur, not presumptuous. Indeed, Poirot murmured, and yet someone was presumptuous enough to commit murder under your nose. Kent bowed again. Then I failed in my duty. Poirot left him there, walking slowly back to the drawing room. He gathered the guests again. They came, weary and wary. Felix with a drink already in hand, Miriam silent, Helena composed, but guarded, Emmett twitching at the wrist. Poirot stood in front of the hearth. There is something deeply troubling about invisibility, he began. It allows evil to masquerade as duty, murder to move as a servant. They watched him. None of you saw the poison poured, and yet it was. This tells me 2 things. 1. The act was done in a place where eyes do not wander. And 2. It was done by someone who is never seen. He turned to Kent, who had entered last. But Kent was not alone in the pantry. All eyes turned. Poirot held up the slip of paper. No one saw him pour it. This, Poirot said, was written by a witness too frightened to come forward. But I found her. He beckoned, and a kitchen maid entered. Barely. 17. Shaking. I didn't know what I saw, she whispered. But I know what I didn't. Poirot nodded. She saw General Rothborn enter the pantry. Alone. Before Kent arrived, she saw him touch only 1 glass. He carried something, a flask. She thought it strange. Then he left. Gasps. Poirot turned slowly. General Rothborn, the poisoner is you. The general rose, face unreadable. You accuse me on a child's word? Poirot smiled faintly. I accuse you on timing, on silence, on motive. He stepped forward. Celeste Ward uncovered that you used Helena's charity to move funds through shell accounts, supporting weapons sales abroad. She confronted you, threatened to expose you to the newspapers, to Parliament, so you decided to silence her. The general's voice was cold. I intended to frighten her. But you failed. You poured poison into Helena's glass, knowing Celeste often switched to drink from it, teasingly. You gambled with your wife's life to preserve your reputation. Helena gasped. You knew she'd drink mine? She always did, the general said, voice low. She always wanted what was yours. Poirot's face was grave. And you, monsieur, always wanted silence. As the constables escorted the general out, Poirot stood at the center of the room, the silence thick around him. Felix whispered, "To think, no one saw it happen." Poirot replied, eyes dark, "Murder often hides in plain sight. We do not look where we are accustomed to trusting." Helena, pale, turned to Poirot. "And what becomes of trust now?" Poirot bowed slightly. "It is the glass we drink from daily, madame, and it is always at risk of being poisoned." The storm had stopped, but the damage had not. The room felt smaller, the night darker, and as Poirot turned away, his words remained in the air like smoke. "In every crime," he whispered to himself, "there is always someone who smiles, before the rest taste the bitterness." Chapter 4. The bitter taste of secrets. The scream came not from the mouth, but from the soul. It was Helena Rothborn's face that twisted first, jaw clenched, nostrils flared, her hand trembling over the silver dome of the breakfast platter before she even lifted it. Her eyes locked on Poirot's, then dropped slowly, as if dreading the confirmation. Beneath the polished lid, lying beside her untouched scone, was a single sprig of wolfsbane, purple, glistening, fatal. No note, no warning, just a flower that did not belong. Poirot's voice was quiet, but absolute. No chef would garnish a plate with that. The entire household had been summoned by then, maids clustered like frightened sparrows, the butler frozen at the doorway, and the guests, once again, drawn into the eye of a storm they could no longer pretend to ignore. The poisoner had left another calling card, not with death this time, but with its scent, a message, a threat, and perhaps a memory. Poirot stood beside the plate, observing not the flower, but the reactions. Felix Marlowe reached for his collar, adjusting it as if to shield his throat. Dr. Miriam Hawthorne took a sharp breath and looked away. Emmett Lee remained frozen, his eyes fixed not on the flower, but on Helena. "Madame," Poirot asked gently, "do you recognize this?" Her voice, when it came, was hoarse. "It was in my mother's garden. She warned me never to touch it. She said it killed her dog when she was a girl." Poirot nodded slowly. "Yes, but this was not placed here to kill. Not directly. It was placed to speak. To say, I could have, I still can." "Then he's not finished," Felix muttered. "Whoever it is, he's still among us." "No," Poirot corrected softly. "It is not he who remains. It is the truth." And the truth, as he knew too well, was always the most dangerous of poisons. Later that morning, Poirot stood at the edge of the cliff, behind Belfort Manor, where the sea crashed below like a trial judge's gavel. The spray hit his shoes, but he did not move. He was not watching the sea. He was watching a piece of paper in his gloved hands, a torn letter recovered from Celeste Ward's chamber, its ink smudged, its words carefully burned at the bottom. Only a few lines remained. "If Helena finds out what you did with the ledger, I can't protect you. Not again." Poirot frowned. Ah, mais oui. The secrets had fermented too long, and now they tasted of fear. Back inside the study, Poirot summoned the three people most entangled in Celeste's past: Emmett Lee, Felix Marlowe, and Miriam Hawthorne. They sat across from him like schoolchildren, caught whispering during confession. "I will ask only once," Poirot said, "and you will answer carefully. Who knew of this letter?" No one spoke. He held up the charred page. It was hidden in Celeste's vanity, beneath a drawer, burned, but not destroyed. A poor attempt. She kept it, despite the risk, and it speaks of a ledger, a document that someone somewhere still fears. Felix scoffed, too quickly. She was always dramatic. Perhaps she wrote it to herself. Ah, the self-addressed threat, Poirot murmured. A charming theory, but false. He turned to Emmett. You handled the estate's finances. You had access to all the accounts. You were the one Celeste most often questioned about discrepancies. I didn't kill her, Emmett said through clenched teeth. Yes, I made adjustments, but under orders. I never touched the wine. Non, monsieur, Poirot said, but you left the door open. Others entered. Miriam's voice broke the tension. The ledger doesn't exist anymore. It was destroyed. Helena made sure of that. Poirot's eyes sharpened. So you saw it. She faltered. I glimpsed a page, a list of names, donations that never arrived, withdrawals in cash. And you told Celeste. Miriam looked away. So the flower this morning, Poirot continued, was not just a warning, it was an accusation, directed at Helena. And yet, he paused. There was no scent of fear from Helena when she lifted that lid. Only recognition. That, my friends, is a detail. Poirot paced to the fireplace. The person who placed the flower knew precisely what memory it would trigger, which means they knew Helena's mother, or at least the story. A silence fell. Then, her gardener, Emmett said quietly. Poirot turned. Pardon? The gardener, years ago. He was dismissed after the dog's death. It was ruled an accident, but there were whispers that he'd trained the dog to go after the general, that it was meant to be a message. Poirot nodded. A message, just like today's. He spun sharply to face Felix. You knew Helena's mother. You wrote her obituary. You visited her once, in that house. You'd have known about the wolfsbane. Felix paled. I was researching a role. Poirot lifted a hand. We? Always acting, always observing. But tell me, monsieur, how long were you and Celeste involved? Felix hesitated. Years ago. Briefly. Briefly? Poirot raised a brow. Then why did she keep your letters? Felix's voice dropped. Because I was the only one who ever told her the truth. A knock came at the door. Esme, the maid, stepped in, holding a silver tray. A telegram for you, sir. Poirot took it, read it, and frowned. It was from Scotland Yard. The results from the residue on the poisoned glass. Traces of strychnine, yes, but mixed with another substance, ground valerian root, a sleeping agent. Poirot's mind raced. He turned slowly. This was not intended to kill swiftly. It was meant to weaken, confuse, then kill. He looked at Miriam. You'd know that combination. I didn't do this. No, he said softly, but you may have recognized its taste. That was it. The bitter taste Celeste remarked upon just before the toast. Poirot remembered the servant mentioning it. A half smile. It's stronger than I remember, Celeste had said. Valerian is used for anxiety, Poirot said. To make someone seem calm. or confused. He turned to Emmett. You administered it to Helena. Daily, you said, to ease her nerves. Did Celeste know that? Emmett's lips parted. Yes. She thought it was unethical. Poirot's voice hardened. Because it wasn't prescribed. It was mixed into her evening drinks, quietly, without her consent. Now everyone looked to Emmett. He stood slowly. She was panicking. I was trying to help her. The general, he expected her to remain composed. To perform, Poirot walked slowly forward. So when Celeste threatened to expose you, you feared the fallout. You didn't want to kill her. Not then, but Felix, he did. Felix's head snapped up. What? Poirot's voice was steel now. You used Emmett's methods, his ingredients. You poured the sleeping agent into her drink first, then the strychnine. You made it look like a careless overdose. Felix backed away. You can't prove that? But I can, Poirot said. The lip print on her glass, placed by you when you mimicked her shade after she'd left the room. You wanted it to seem accidental. You wanted Emmett blamed. Felix froze. I found the tube, Poirot said, in your coat pocket. A woman's lipstick. Celeste's shade. You used it once, sloppily. Felix collapsed into the chair. She was going to ruin everything, he muttered. Expose everyone. I gave her a way out, a clean exit, a painless one. But it wasn't painless, Poirot said coldly. It was public, it was humiliating, and it was you who made it bitter. As the constables arrived, Poirot remained at the edge of the firelight. Helena approached quietly. Do you believe any of them loved her? Poirot shook his head once. They loved what she knew. They feared what she could say. But no, madame, I do not believe they loved her. Helena whispered. Then what is the cost of truth? Poirot looked at her with sadness. The same as poison, madame. It depends on the dose. And as the storm began again, washing Belfort Manor in fresh grief, Poirot stood alone, with the flower still on the tray, its purple head wilting, beautiful, deadly, and unforgiving. Chapter 5. Her last word was his name. The blood had dried in a perfect crescent under her nose, a delicate ghastly smear of red on otherwise porcelain skin. Celeste Ward lay as she had died, frozen, eyes wide, mouth parted in the shape of a single word that only one man in the room knew had been meant for him. Hercule Poirot stood motionless beside the chaise, where her body had been laid out for the coroner. The early morning light filtered through lace curtains, falling in fractured rays across her pale brow, and for a brief second she seemed as though she might speak again. But the silence was deeper now, final. Whose name did she say? Helena whispered from behind Poirot. You were closest to her. You must have heard. Poirot did not answer immediately. Instead, his gaze moved to her parted lips, and in his mind, he heard it again, just as he had the night it happened. Not clearly, not loudly, but whispered like a curse. Alistair. Helena stepped forward. Was it my husband's name? Poirot turned slightly, not to face her, but to gaze at the fireplace, where the flames still danced despite the warm hour. It was not said in affection, madame. There is something particular about the way a dying woman speaks a name. It is never an accident, not a guess. It is an indictment or a confession. Celeste had known something, not just about money or affairs, something far older, more personal. And with that single word, Alistair, She had not only identified her killer, but offered Poirot the key to unravel the rest. But as always, the truth is never so obliging. Names can lie, and a dying woman's voice can be misheard. That was the danger. Poirot began his day not with tea, but with a question. What did Celeste know that made her speak the general's name? And why did her killer let her speak at all? In the parlor, Poirot observed General Rothbourne seated in the corner, polishing a military medal with deliberate force. His mustache twitched faintly when Poirot entered. "You were in the hallway when she collapsed," Poirot said, "yet you never moved." "I didn't see the point," Rothbourne replied without looking up. "She was already gone." Poirot walked closer, slow as a shadow stretching across the rug. "But you heard her. You heard her say your name." Rothbourne's hand paused. A delusion. Drug-induced, she'd been drinking. Poirot's voice dropped. "But it was your name." The general said nothing. Poirot continued, "And that is curious, mon général, because to say a name aloud at death is not common. The lips grow heavy, the tongue fails, and yet she used her final breath to accuse you. Why?" "I wouldn't know," Rothbourne snapped, standing abruptly. "Perhaps she wanted revenge." "Ah," Poirot said softly, "but revenge requires motive." The general's eyes met his. "Then find one." Poirot left without another word, not because he was defeated, but because Rothbourne had revealed too much. A man who says, "Perhaps she wanted revenge," is not questioning, he is confirming. And that told Poirot one thing. There had been a moment between them before she died, long before she drank the poisoned toast. A shared history, a secret wound, one now festering into murder. Back in Celeste's room, Poirot turned to her personal effects. Her handbag, a notebook, letters, but the most telling item was a photograph hidden behind a false panel in her drawer. A young woman, Celeste unmistakably, standing between two boys, one grinning, the other unsmiling, hands behind his back. The inscription read, "Cambridge, 1914. Poirot flipped it over. A second note, handwritten, smudged but legible. "He never forgave me for choosing the wrong brother." A name was scrawled in the corner, Alistair. Poirot exhaled slowly. Ah, mon Dieu. It was not revenge. It was guilt. Guilt she had carried perhaps for decades. And now he understood. Celeste and the general were not casual acquaintances. They were bound by history. Poirot gathered the guests in the conservatory that evening. The light was dim. The storm returned, soft at first, like a whisper, but steady. The vines on the windows shivered as if the house itself strained to listen. "I have discovered," Poirot began, "that the deceased, Mademoiselle Ward, had a history with our host. Not of business, not of recent scandal, but of something far more dangerous. Affection. Betrayed affection." He held up the photograph. This was taken nearly 30 years ago. Celeste. Two brothers, one of whom is General Rothbourne. The other, his late younger brother, Thomas Rothbourne, who died in the trenches of the Great War. Helena gasped. "I never knew—" "She never spoke of it," the general said flatly. "She did," Poirot replied. "To one person, her lawyer. She had recently updated her will, and in it, she left a note requesting that the truth of Thomas Rothbourne's death be sent to the Times, unless she died peacefully." Now silence fell like an axe. "She believed," Poirot said, "that Alistair was responsible for his brother's death." Rothbourne's voice was iron. "That's a lie." Poirot stepped forward. And yet she wrote, "He never forgave me for choosing the wrong brother." He turned to Miriam Hawthorne. "You read this note, did you not?" She nodded slowly. "Celeste gave me a copy. She said, if anything happened, I should pass it to the press." "And did you?" "I didn't get the chance," she whispered. "She died too soon." "Or exactly when someone needed her to," Poirot said grimly. Then Poirot walked to the desk and lifted a second item, a pocket watch. He turned it open. "Thomas's initials," he said. "It was in the general's study, but this watch was said to be lost in France, buried with his brother." He held it up. "So why is it here, monsieur?" Rothborn said. "Nothing." Poirot delivered the truth like a dagger. "Because Thomas did not die in battle. He died in retreat, shot from behind, by you." Gasps. Then the rising, trembling voice of Emmett Lee. "That's impossible." Poirot's eyes locked on the general. "You blamed him for taking the woman you loved, for being softer, kinder. You killed him in the fog of war, and you spent 3 decades silencing those who remembered." "And now Celeste remembered too much," Helena said, voice breaking. "She remembered everything," Poirot confirmed. "She tried to forgive him, but the moment she discovered he was laundering funds through charities, using the very war widow foundations Thomas would have wept to see exploited, she could not stay silent." The general stood, fists clenched. "She betrayed me," Poirot replied softly. "No, she named you." "And so what?" the general snapped. "She spoke my name. That doesn't prove I poisoned her." "No," Poirot said, "but the bottle does." He held it aloft, a vintage wine bottle discovered beneath the floorboards in the butler's pantry. A hidden compartment. The residue inside tested positive for strychnine, and the seal, examined under microscope, revealed fingerprints. Alistair Rothborn's. "You poured the wine yourself," Poirot said. "Hours before dinner. Left the bottle in the pantry, told the butler which one to use." The general sat down slowly, like a man returning to his sentence. "I loved her," he said softly. "I never stopped." Poirot bowed his head. "Then you should have let her speak the whole truth." The constables arrived not long after. Poirot remained in the room alone, watching the rain trace paths down the glass. Helena lingered. "She spoke his name," she said again, as if reliving it. Her final word. "Yes," Poirot said, "and not out of fear, but justice. She knew he would never confess, so she made sure I would ask the right question." "And what question is that?" Poirot turned, eyes somber. "Who benefits from silence, and who dies from it?" The thunder cracked, and Belfort Manor was quiet once more. Chapter 6. The wine list. Lied. The sommelier's hands trembled as he unfolded the wine list, though the ink on the page remained steady. It was Miriam who noticed it first, her eyes narrowing, her fork paused mid-air. "That bottle wasn't on the menu," she murmured. Hercule Poirot, seated silently at the far end of the dining table, heard her, and without looking up from his untouched glass, simply said, "Indeed, Doctor." It was not. Outside, the sea clawed at the cliffs like it wanted. Wind scraped against the long windows of Belfort Manor with all the violence of withheld truth. A gust pressed a shiver through the candle flames as the butler returned from the cellar, pale as the linens draped across the polished table. He carried the bottle, its seal fractured, its label too new for a wine said to be 30 years aged. Poirot watched the bottle being set down with the precision of a funeral offering. It was a Rothschild 1890. At least, that's what the label declared, but Poirot had already observed 3 things wrong with it. The cork was not hand-punched, the glass was too thick for the decade, and the capsule bore a crest that hadn't existed before 1905. He stood quietly, drawing no attention to himself as he approached the bottle. "May I?" he asked no one in particular. The room fell into that unnatural hush that only fear can command. Poirot rotated the bottle in the candlelight. "Curious," he said softly, tracing the crest with a gloved finger. "The wine is not what it claims to be. But lies, you see, they age poorly." Murmurs spread across the table like smoke. Helena Rothborn looked across to Felix Marlowe, who adjusted his napkin with far too much care. Emmett Lee's spoon clinked awkwardly against his plate, and Dr. Miriam Hawthorne remained rigid, her eyes fixed on the bottle like it might explode. "Someone switched it," Helena said. "It was meant to be the bottle my husband saved for our anniversary." "Oui," Poirot replied. "But it was not opened for celebration. It was opened for manipulation." He lifted the cork. "The residue inside this bottle does not belong to any French vineyard. It is bitter, synthetic, and deadly." General Rothborn, seated at the head of the table, shifted ever so slightly, but Poirot caught it. "You look uncomfortable, mon général." The general did not meet his eyes. "I find death bitter," he said, "even when it arrives in disguise." Poirot returned to his seat. The wine list lied, but so did someone at this table. And as with the bottle, the seal has now broken. Later that night, Poirot stood before the vast mahogany cabinet in the Manor's drawing room. The ledger sat open, a recent inventory of wines. He examined the list with care, page by page, row by row, until finally his finger halted. A name, Chateau Belfort, Private Reserve, logged under a date that did not exist, September 31st. Poirot smiled to himself. "There is no 31st day in September," he said aloud. "Forged," came a voice behind him. Miriam entered, arms folded. "Oui," Poirot replied, and poorly. She walked to the cabinet and pulled open a drawer. Inside were dozens of labels, carefully cut and stored. "He made a hobby of forgery," she whispered. "Not for money, for control." Poirot turned. "Who?" She looked up. "The general. Alistair kept bottles no one else had, made vintages up when real ones ran dry. Guests believed what the label told them." Poirot nodded slowly. "Because appearance was his religion. He hated disorder," she said. "Despised change. That's why Celeste terrified him. She knew the truth beneath the labels." "Yes." Poirot considered her for a long moment. "And so did you." She looked down. "Monsieur Emmett," Poirot said later, when the guests had retired and the moon cast long shadows across the halls, "you once said Celeste had no enemies." "I was wrong," Emmett replied. "She had one, but he wore a uniform and claimed to defend her." Poirot smiled faintly. "Ah, mon ami, that is the nature of wolves. They do not attack in the open. They wait for the storm, for the darkness." Poirot laid out the remaining wine bottles on the long table in the study, lining them like soldiers in review. Each bore a label, authentic or not, and he began removing them one by one. In the end, only 3 remained without forgeries. 2 opened, 1 full. He opened the full one. The smell hit like rust and medicine. "Strange," he said. "The wine that killed Celeste was not chosen at random. It was planted, labeled, served." He turned the bottle and saw, etched faintly along the bottom, a mark. M.H. Miriam Hawthorne, he whispered. But no, he knew her hands. Too precise, too careful. This etching was done in haste, and yet the implication, it was bait. He summoned her to the study. This, he said, showing her, the bottle, was not your doing, but it was your bottle. She froze. He waited. She spoke. He used my name to cover his trail. That bottle was from my clinic. It held tincture, not wine. I told him to dispose of it. He said he would. Instead, Poirot finished, he used it to kill. Helena appeared in the doorway, ghost-like. Then he was planning it for longer than we thought. Poirot turned. Oui, madame. Murder is never spontaneous in men like Alistair Rothbourne. It is arranged, like his dining room, like his life. But the twist had not yet come. It came hours later, as Poirot traced the etched initials more closely under the magnifying glass. Not M.H.W.H. He sat upright. William Hawthorne, Miriam's late brother, a surgeon, dead 10 years, but once accused of malpractice at Alistair's command. Disgraced, driven from medicine, Poirot's mind leapt. The general had stolen the bottle from William's remaining stock, long kept, hidden, perhaps given to Miriam out of shame or memory, and used it not only to poison, but to frame her. A perfect circle of vengeance. Poirot returned to the fireplace. The others gathered once more. The bottle sat in the center like a loaded gun. He began slowly. Celeste Ward was murdered. We know this. But the method, the bottle, the list, it was all misdirection. A lie on a label. He turned to the general. You had the wine list adjusted. You had the bottle placed. You etched false initials to discredit Miriam, to ensure if suspicion came, it fell on her. And you succeeded, for a time. Alistair stood. You have no proof. No, Poirot said, but I have pattern. You killed your brother. You defrauded the war widows. You used labels and uniforms and polished lies to cover rot. And in the end, you feared one woman, Celeste, because she knew. Poirot held out the wine list with the false date. She recorded this the day before her death. She knew it was coming. She wanted someone to see it. Then she should have acted sooner, Rothbourne spat. She did, Poirot said. She said your name. The general tried to speak, but his words caught in his throat. Poirot stepped closer. And now, mon général, so will I. The constables arrived. This time, they did not knock. As Rothbourne was led away, Poirot remained seated by the fire. Helena sat beside him, stunned. How many more lies do you think he told? She asked. Poirot sipped his tea. All of them, madam. But lies, you see, are like bad wine. They sour long before they are swallowed. And the label, always, will betray the bottle. Chapter 7. The fingerprint on the flute. The broken champagne flute lay in the silver tray like a fallen crown, its stem glinting under the flicker of a guttering candle. But it was the smudge, small, oily, unmistakably human, that made everyone stop breathing. Poirot saw it first. Not the shattered crystal or the wine that had dried in dark burgundy streaks down the sides, but the fingerprint, singular, clear, almost deliberate. No gloves, he said softly, and no second thoughts. His voice did not rise, but it cut through the hush like a straight razor. In the moments before the discovery, the drawing room had felt deceptively calm. The storm had relented. The fire crackled low. The guests, worn down by confessions and suspicions, sat scattered across the furniture like marionettes after a performance. Tangled, expressionless, spent. But now, with one fragment of glass offering more truth than all their words combined, silence turned sharp. A single fingerprint on the stem of the poisoned flute meant everything. It was a whisper from the crime scene itself, and it had finally decided to speak. Poirot crouched over the tray, his fingers hovering above the crystal but never touching. "Champagne is a drink of celebration," he murmured, but here it became a chalice of betrayal. And now it returns a signature. Helena stood rigid by the window, her eyes glistening. Miriam, seated beside the fireplace, said nothing but reached for her medical bag as if it offered comfort. Emmett shifted in his chair, one hand resting nervously near his cufflink. And Felix Marlowe, the actor whose emotions always seemed 2 shades too vivid, crossed to the tray with the forced calm of a man approaching a stage prop. "Surely it could be anyone's," he said. "A servant, perhaps." "No," Poirot replied without looking at him. "This glass was not carried by the staff. It was poured and placed by someone in this room." He stood. "The fingerprint will speak louder than protest. And fingerprints, unlike alibis, do not lie." The guests scattered for the night, like insects from sudden light, but Poirot did not sleep. He waited as the butler locked the doors, waited as the clock ticked past 2, then 3. The manor settled into uneasy stillness, yet Poirot remained seated in the study with the flute placed under a glass dome, protected now like a relic. And in the silence, he allowed his mind to retrace the steps of the evening again, not from the perspective of the victim, but from the glass. Where had it traveled? Whose hand had lifted it, set it down? Who had offered the fatal toast? The fingerprint, when dusted by the constable dispatched from the village, had revealed a partial, imperfect but distinctive. It did not match the prints Poirot had subtly taken from Miriam's pen, from Emmett's watch, or from Helena's compact. But when matched against the silver cigarette case Felix had left on the console table, there was a resonance, a partial match, enough to raise suspicion, enough to provoke confrontation. The next morning, Poirot called Felix to the drawing room. "You fancy yourself a man of details, monsieur," he said, gesturing to the row of leather-bound volumes on the side table, scripts, notes, stage directions. But real life does not follow cues. Felix gave a tired smile. "Everything is performance, Monsieur Poirot. Even guilt." "Non," Poirot replied. "Performance can be faked, but pressure reveals the truth beneath." He held up the photograph from Celeste's room again. Felix, younger, standing beside Celeste and the Rothborn brothers. A 4th person stood half-cropped in the image, someone long forgotten or deliberately removed. But Poirot had magnified it earlier, and now he had a name. Evelyn Trevors, a war nurse and former lover of General Rothborn. She had vanished after the war under mysterious circumstances, officially dead, but perhaps not entirely. "What happened to her?" Poirot asked. Felix frowned. "Who?" Poirot tapped the photo. "You knew her. You all did." Felix shifted. "She died." Or was silenced. "No," Felix said firmly. "Not by us." Poirot tilted his head. "You say us. Who do you protect, monsieur?" Felix exhaled. Alistair had a temper. Evelyn discovered his affair with Celeste, accused him of betrayal. She threatened to expose him to the board of officers. And then? She disappeared. That's all I know. That's all you say, Poirot corrected. But it is not the same thing. He let Felix leave and immediately turned his attention to the cellar. The wine rack still bore the same dust patterns, but one bottle slot showed a smear, a handprint where there should be none. The bottle, once in that slot, matched the flute in shape and pour quantity. The poison, then, had been added before the pouring, in the shadows of the cellar, where only one person moved freely and often. Poirot returned to the butler. "Kent," he said, "you are a man of habit, yes?" "Yes, sir. And yet last Tuesday you took a leave. Unusual, no?" Kent hesitated. "Personal business, sir." Poirot's eyes glinted. "You went to London. You visited an apothecary. You bought strychnine." Kent froze. "I was told it was for rats." "Rats," Poirot repeated. "How convenient." He waited, but Kent said no more. Poirot made a note. The poison may have been placed by a different hand than the one who poured the drink. And the fingerprint, it was left not by the murderer, but by the one who was meant to drink it. It was Helena's. The glass had been hers. She had touched it when offering the toast, but the glass had been switched. Poirot gathered them all in the grand hall that evening. "I have uncovered the truth," he said, "but it is not what you expect. This murder was not a crime of passion, but of legacy." He looked to Emmett. "You discovered the General's financial crimes and threatened to tell Celeste. To Miriam, you knew the General's past sins and tried to protect Helena by any means necessary. To Felix, you knew Evelyn did not die naturally, and you remained silent. And then to Helena, you poured the champagne." Gasps echoed. "But it was meant for you," Emmett said. "No," Poirot replied. "It was meant for Celeste. Helena discovered the truth about Evelyn. She confronted Celeste, who admitted everything. Helena feared disgrace. She snapped." Helena sank into a chair. "I didn't mean to kill her. I just wanted to stop her." Poirot nodded. "So you offered the toast. You handed her the flute, but at the last moment, in a twist of fate, she took the other glass," Helena whispered. Poirot approached. "Your fingerprint, madame, is what revealed the switch. It was not evidence of guilt. It was evidence of your original plan." She nodded. "I thought if I left it, it would seem accidental." "No," Poirot said. "It was too deliberate. And the flute, madame?" It spoke. As Helena was taken into custody, Miriam turned to Poirot. "Did Celeste know?" "Yes," he replied. "She suspected. That is why she said his name. Not because he poisoned her, but because he made all of this possible. She wanted us to look deeper." He looked at the shattered glass. "Even broken, a flute can still carry the truth." And then more, to himself. "It is not the poison that kills. It is the silence poured beside it." Chapter 8. The host changed the seating. The dining room was too quiet. It wasn't the kind of silence born of etiquette or exhaustion. It was heavier, unnatural, as if the room itself had swallowed its breath and waited. Poirot noticed it the moment he crossed the threshold. The candles burned too low, the soup had cooled too quickly, and the guests sat a half-inch out of rhythm, eyes darting, fingers twitching, and every mouth tight around unsaid things. But what struck him most was the place cards moved, not all of them, just two. Enough to matter, enough to kill. And it was Felix Marlowe who said it first, tipping his wineglass with a smirk far too forced to be casual. "Strange, isn't it? We've all sat at this table a dozen times, and yet tonight the order felt wrong. Did anyone else notice the host change the seating?" It was not a question. It was a challenge. Poirot turned to the head of the table. The general, polished as ever, showed nothing but the faintest pause in breath. And yet that single hesitation was enough for Poirot to feel the ripple of truth pass under the silverware. He glanced down at his own card, now resting where Miriam should have been. Emmett was on Poirot's left, though he had always preferred to sit beside Helena. Miriam had been moved to the far end, beside the kitchen door. And Celeste had sat in a place of prominence, directly beside the general. Her death toast had been given in that very seat. And now, Poirot finally understood. It had not been chance that placed her beside the wine. It had been choice. He rose from the table slowly, as if disturbed by indigestion, but his eyes were already scanning the floor, the sideboard, the velvet folds of the drawn curtains. "Forgive me," he said, "but I must fetch something from the drawing-room." He did not wait for a reply. As he passed the hall, Poirot replayed every step. The original seating chart, the one Esme, the maid, had shown him, was scribbled quickly but clear. Celeste had been assigned to seat 4. Yet she sat in seat 2, and the only person with reason, access, and authority to make such a last-minute change was the host himself. Poirot found Esme alone near the stair, holding a tray of untouched cordial. "Mademoiselle," he said softly, "who changed the cards?" She bit her lip. I'm not sure, sir." "You are sure," he said gently, "but you are afraid." Her eyes glistened. It was the General. Poirot bowed his head. "Merci." He returned to the dining room. The guests were standing now, murmuring among themselves. Felix leaned against the mantel, half in shadow. Emmett toyed with his watch chain. Helena clutched her glass tightly, too tightly for someone who hadn't drunk more than a sip. Miriam was the only one still seated, gazing down at her empty plate like it might begin to speak. Poirot raised a hand. "Mes amis, you must forgive me. It appears we have all overlooked something rather important." They stilled. "Someone changed the seating arrangement before dinner, and in doing so, they rewrote the script of the evening, because where one sits determines what one drinks." Felix stiffened. "What are you saying?" "I am saying," Poirot replied, "that the poison was never meant for Celeste." Gasps echoed. The wind outside howled as if summoned by the accusation. It was meant for another, but the switch, subtle as it was, placed her in the path of death. He walked to the table and held up 2 cards. Celeste and Miriam, their places were swapped. All eyes turned to Miriam. Poirot did not. He turned to the general. "You arranged the change," he said quietly. "You had Esme move the cards. You told no one, not even your wife." The general said nothing. "Why?" Poirot asked. "Why would you place Celeste beside you?" "She asked," the general replied. "She preferred the view." Poirot's brow lifted. "Or did you prefer the proximity, the control?" Silence. "I believe," Poirot continued, "you suspected Miriam had discovered the ledger. You feared she might act. You thought to silence her, but in your arrogance, you forgot one thing." He lifted the place card marked Miriam Hawthorne. "She did not sit here." He turned to Celeste's seat. "She did." Miriam rose slowly. "You were trying to kill me." The general's jaw clenched. "You were a threat." Poirot said nothing for a long moment. Then, "So was she." The moment Celeste sat down, she sealed her fate. "But it wasn't my hand that poured the wine," the general snapped. "No," Poirot agreed. "It was Emmett." Emmett stumbled back. I was asked to." The general said the bottle was pre-selected. I didn't know. Poirot faced him. You knew the glass had been poisoned. No, Emmett shouted. I swear. But you saw the switch, Poirot interrupted, and you said nothing. Poirot turned to the others. This murder was not a single blow. It was a conspiracy of silence, a web of inaction. Felix stepped forward. Then what of me? You still think I had something to do with it? Poirot's eyes narrowed. You provided the distraction, the toast, the performance. You raised your glass first, and when Celeste followed, you made sure the others did not see her wince. You played your part. Felix swallowed. He threatened me. Poirot faced the general one final time. You orchestrated the scene. You changed the seating. You chose the bottle. You selected the victim. The general straightened. Prove it. Poirot smiled faintly. I already have. The original seating chart has a drop of wax in the corner. Red. You use blue. The chart was written by Esme, your copy, forged, sloppily. He held up the duplicate. You tried to erase the motive by controlling the moment. But murder, monsieur, is not choreography. It is chaos. The general was as silent. Helena wept quietly in the corner. Poirot stepped back. The chair that was meant to save you, he said softly, became the one that damned her. As the constables arrived to take the general away, Poirot remained at the table. One hand on the place card, one finger tracing the edge. Miriam approached. If she hadn't moved, but she did, Poirot said, because that is how fate works. The smallest shift, the gentlest lie, and a life is lost. Miriam sat beside him. Do you believe in justice, Monsieur Poirot? He looked at the chair where Celeste had sat. I believe, he said, that justice often comes late, but it always arrives, with a name on a card. Chapter 9. The waiter remembered nothing. The tray slipped from his hands and shattered on the stone floor like a scream no one heard in time. The sound was sharp, sudden, and it brought every head in the drawing room up with a start. Tea spilled across the Persian rug. Cups rolled to the corners, and the young waiter, his eyes wide and glassy, stood frozen in the middle of the mess as if he'd just awoken from a nightmare. I don't know what happened, he whispered, his voice distant, trembling. I don't remember. It was that sentence that made Hercule Poirot stop mid-step. Not the clatter, not the tea, but the tone of the boy's voice. Not shock, not clumsiness, confusion. Genuine confusion. No one forgets everything, mon garçon, Poirot said gently, approaching him. Unless, of course, they were meant to. He guided the boy, young, no older than 19, to a chair, careful not to overwhelm him, as the rest of the room slowly returned to its seated, suspicious quiet. Poirot had been observing the lad for 3 days now. Quiet, quick on his feet, eyes always down, too polished to be freshly trained, and yet his movements were not his own. They were rehearsed, memorized, as though someone had drilled them into him, word by word, step by step. Poirot knelt beside him and placed a hand on his shoulder. What do you recall of the dinner, Lucien? The boy blinked. I set the table. I poured the wine, then the toast, and then the floor. I don't remember the glasses being switched. There it was again. That same sentence, the same omission. The glasses, Poirot echoed quietly. I did not mention them. Lucien stiffened. You didn't? No, and yet you did? The guests were silent now, watching from the walls of Belfort's study like painted ghosts. Miriam stood beside the fireplace, arms crossed. Emmett lingered by the decanter, pale but alert. Felix, ever the actor, tilted his head with just the right amount of concern. And Helena, she stood near the window, back to the room, as though her own reflection might shield her from what was to come. Poirot stood. "Lucien, someone gave you instructions, not for service, for silence." "We?" The boy hesitated, then nodded. Slowly. "Yes." "Who?" Lucien's mouth opened, but nothing came out. A single tear slid down his cheek. "I can't." "He said he'd make it look like I was the one who poured it, that I'd be next." Poirot nodded, eyes soft but voice like steel. "Then you will allow me to speak in your place." He turned to the room. "Mes amis," he said, "we are very near the truth now. But it lies not in motive, not even in the method. It lies in memory, or the absence of it." He gestured to the shattered tray. Lucien was drugged. A mild sedative, enough to blur details, to make him unreliable, and therefore the perfect scapegoat. Miriam stepped forward. "Are you certain?" Poirot's eyes locked with hers. "Oui, madame. I found traces of powdered laudanum on the edge of the service cloth in the pantry, enough to dull awareness, not enough to render unconscious." "Then who did it?" Felix asked. "You think one of us drugged the boy?" Poirot did not answer. Instead, he walked to the center of the room and picked up a silver bell from the side table. On the night of the murder, Celeste drank from a glass that was not hers. But the switch occurred moments before the toast, which means someone had to distract the waiter, someone who rang this bell and summoned him to the next room. He rang it once. Its chime echoed, soft and eerie. The bell was rung not by a guest, but from inside the pantry, Poirot said. A second bell, connected to this one, activated only when the main switch is engaged in the butler's office. He turned slowly, which only one person had access to, General Rothborn. Gasps. "But he's gone," Helena said, quietly. Poirot nodded. "Yes. Arrested. But he was not the only one who planned. Murder, madame, is rarely a solitary art. It is a duet." He faced the room again. The general changed the seating, but someone else executed the final switch, and that someone drugged Lucien to make sure no one else remembered seeing it. Emmett swallowed. "You mean—" "I mean," Poirot said, "that Felix Marlowe left the room seconds before the toast. He returned, holding Celeste's compact, claiming he'd found it under her chair." Felix blinked. "It was hers." Poirot stepped forward. "It was planted by you. And when you bent to pick it up, you switched the glasses." Felix's voice was quieter now. "You can't prove that." Poirot raised a hand. "No, but I do not need to. You left more than a fingerprint." He turned to Lucien. "Show them." The boy reached into his pocket and drew out a scrap of torn cloth, the edge of a white handkerchief. Monogrammed, "F.M." "You used it to wipe the rim," Poirot said, "but it snagged on the silver tray. Lucien saw it. He forgot. Until now." Felix's face darkened. "She deserved it," he said suddenly. "She was going to ruin everything. The general was bad enough, but she was going to drag me with him. She had the letters. She knew about Evelyn." Poirot's voice softened. "You could have walked away." "No," Felix said. "Not from this. I was in too deep." He stepped back, breath shaking. Poirot nodded to the constables waiting at the door. As they took him, Miriam turned to Poirot, eyes wet. "Why the waiter?" "Because," Poirot said, "he was the most invisible person in the room, and so he became the most dangerous. Helena approached. Did Celeste know? Poirot nodded. She always knew. But she played her part, right to the end. Helena's voice broke. Then what was her mistake? Poirot looked at the shattered tray, then the torn cloth, then the frightened boy, still seated by the fire. She trusted memory over evidence, and when memory fails... He turned to the window, where the storm had returned in full force. Murder thrives. Chapter 10. The Recipe for Murder. The copper pot had boiled dry, its bottom scorched black, the room steeped in the acrid smell of burnt thyme, and something more sinister, something metallic, faintly sweet, clinging to the air like a ghost of violence. Poirot bent over it in the dim light of the manor's kitchen, a single candle casting warped shadows across the tiled walls. He touched the edge of the pot with a gloved finger, then lifted it to his nose. Almond, artificial, a whisper of cyanide. He stood slowly and said aloud, "This was no meal. This was preparation." The cook, silent until then, let out a single, stifled sob. She leaned against the larder door, apron smeared, eyes wide and glassy. "I didn't see who added it, monsieur. I swear it wasn't me. I never leave the herbs unattended." "No," Poirot said gently, "but someone made sure you did." He walked past her and opened the small tin labeled Herbe de Provence. Beneath the familiar scent of rosemary and lavender was a subtler note, crushed bitter almonds, crushed finely and folded into the mixture like a final ingredient in a deadly dessert. He turned to the maid, who'd discovered the pot hours earlier, and questioned her again about what she saw, what she smelled. But the girl was firm. The pot had boiled on the back of the stove all evening, and no one had touched it since, except for the general's manservant, briefly, around 7, and Felix, who had passed through, whistling, looking for wine. Poirot nodded. That fit. Murder, like soufflé, required precise timing, and someone had followed the recipe. He returned to the drawing room, where the guests were once again gathered by request, their faces tight with suspicion and exhaustion. Helena stood nearest the fire, arms crossed. Miriam had taken to pouring herself strong brandy with more frequency, while Emmett now sat rigid, avoiding Felix's glances entirely. Felix, as always, tried too, hard to appear untouched, his collar perfect, his expression one of amused disdain, but his hands, those betrayed him. They trembled, just enough. Poirot took the floor slowly. "Mes amis," he began, "I have uncovered the next step in this elaborate plan. The poison was not administered only through the wine. Non, it was cooked, steeped, blended, hidden in something more innocuous, more intimate, in the very meal itself." A hush settled. Poirot continued. "The stew, served the night Celeste Ward died, was rich with flavor. But one ingredient was added not by the cook, not by her assistants, but by someone with knowledge, both of the kitchen and of death." Felix scoffed. "Surely you're not suggesting we all be poisoned slowly over the course of a week?" "No," Poirot said. "The poison was not meant to kill all. It was not universal. It was precise, administered in a single portion. For a single plate." He paused. "Celeste's." Miriam frowned. "But the stew was served from the same pot." "But the bowls were prepared individually before being brought out," Poirot said. "The cook told me as much. The ladle was wiped, the garnish placed carefully on each bowl. But Celeste's bowl, hers had thyme sprigs from a separate dish." Emmett leaned forward. "You think someone tampered with the herbs?" "Oui." And they used a kitchen the rest of you had no reason to visit, except one. Poirot turned slowly to Felix. You claimed you went to fetch wine. Felix met his gaze. I did. Poirot nodded. And yet the wine you brought was already chilled, uncorked, and decanted. There was no need to visit the cellar at all. Felix said nothing. You knew the layout, Poirot said softly. You studied the manor for your performance at Lady Helena's birthday last year. You told the story of the manor's secret wine vault to amuse the guests. Helena's eyes widened. I remember that. You joked that the kitchen held more secrets than the library. Poirot gestured to the herbs again. Celeste's bowl was dosed with cyanide, folded into time, and served with intent. The rest of you were served from the same pot, but her garnish, her final ingredient, was delivered from death's own hand. The room fell into silence. Then Felix laughed, brittle and broken. Do you know what she was going to do? He said, voice cracking. She was going to expose the entire Rothbourne estate as a fraud, the stolen funds, the shell accounts, the charities that never existed. And me, she was going to drag me into it. Say I forged signatures, threatened to ruin me with letters I wrote when I was 19. Poirot was quiet. She said she'd publish them, that I'd be finished, and I would have been. You chose silence, Poirot said quietly. You chose a recipe that ended her voice. Felix sank into the chair, eyes glazed, but Poirot held up a hand. And yet, there is one more twist. He turned to Emmett. You told me the ledger she found. She never gave it to anyone, that it vanished after her death. Emmett nodded. But that's not true, Poirot said, because someone returned it. To the kitchen, hidden beneath the lining of the drawer where the time was kept, a place no one would check, unless they were cleaning up after a mistake. Poirot lifted a wrapped parcel from the table. And the ledger, mon ami, contains not only falsified accounts, but a list of names, beneficiaries, payouts, and one entry from over a decade ago. He opened it. To Evelyn Trevors, nurse, Rothbourne estate, £500, paid by General Rothbourne. Helena's breath caught. Evelyn, she worked for us before she vanished. Poirot nodded. Because she learned something she should not have. About the General, about Felix, and she too was silenced. The payment was her hush money, but it didn't buy her safety. Poirot turned again to Felix. You helped forge that payment. Felix didn't deny it. Poirot stepped back. So you see, mes amis, murder is not an isolated act. It is not one poison. It is a sequence, a meal, carefully prepared, one ingredient at a time. Miriam whispered. A recipe. Poirot nodded. The recipe for murder. And tonight, we saw the final course. As the constables led Felix away, the house remained still. Poirot stood at the table, his hand on the copper pot that started it all. Murder, like cuisine, he murmured, relies on the delicate balance of boldness and patience. But in the end, there is always one flavor that overpowers the rest. He looked into the darkness. Regret. Chapter 11. One sip, two motives. The glass was still full when she fell. It tipped only after her body had already begun to collapse. First the soft clatter of silverware, then her eyes, wide and glassy, catching the reflection of the chandelier, one last time before the crystal flute rolled from her limp fingers and struck the floor. Only then did the wine spill, dark, viscous, and far too silent for what it carried. Poirot did not move. His eyes were already on the face, not the glass, noting the dilation in the pupils, the slackness in the jaw. Then, carefully, he bent, not to the woman, for the doctor was already there, but to the glass. He sniffed. "Ah," he murmured, "this is not merely wine. This is confession." The room around him fractured into gasps and motion. Miriam called for water. Emmett backed into the wall, like he might escape the room entirely. Felix, predictably, reached for drama, his voice high, hands fluttering, his gaze shifting too, quickly from the body to Poirot and back again. And Helena stood still, as marble, her hand covering her mouth, as if trying to shove something back inside. Shock, or guilt, or knowledge. It was the second poisoning. But this time, the victim survived. Barely. Lydia Tremaine, the journalist who'd arrived 2 nights before, under the guise of a distant cousin of Celeste, now lay pale and twitching on the rug of the drawing room, having taken but a sip from a flute that was, according to place cards and etiquette, meant for Felix Marlowe. Poirot straightened. "Curious," he said. "The poisoned glass finds its way not to the actor, but to the observer. That is twice now. Twice the poison has missed its mark." The guests stared. No one spoke. He turned slowly, his gaze sweeping across them. "This was not clumsiness," he said. "This was not fate. This was deliberate." Later, in the warmth of the study, Poirot sat alone beside the fire, with a single photograph on his lap, the last group photo taken before Celeste's death. In it, Lydia stood to the far left, just beyond frame, only a sliver of her hat captured in the mirror behind the guests. She had been present, but not visible. Present, but never accounted for, just as she had been throughout the investigation, watching, recording, pretending. "Ah," Poirot murmured, "and yet she nearly became the final chapter." The doctor entered quietly. "She'll live," he said. "Small dose, not enough to kill, but enough to stun." Poirot nodded. Then it was a warning. Or a mistake. "Non," Poirot said, rising. "The killer does not make mistakes, only choices." He summoned the guests once more. The storm outside had calmed, but the manor had never felt more tense. "This was no isolated incident," Poirot began. "The second poisoning confirms what I have long suspected. This is not the work of a single motive. This is the collision of two." They stared. "Let me explain." He walked to the drinks tray and held up the flute. "This glass was meant for Felix." But Lydia drank from it. Why? Because someone moved the cards again. As they did on the night Celeste died. Once is coincidence. Twice is design. He turned to Emmett. "You said you saw Felix place the cards before dinner." Emmett nodded. "And yet," Poirot said, "your own card was in a different position than the one you showed me in your own handwriting, meaning it was changed after Felix placed it." Felix paled. "I didn't touch it again." "No," Poirot agreed. "Because Helena did." All eyes turned. Helena lowered her gaze. "I was trying to protect him," she whispered. "I thought someone would poison him." Poirot's voice was soft. "Because you knew about the ledger. You knew Felix helped your husband. You feared Lydia had come to expose him. So you moved the cards to shield him." Helena nodded. "But in doing so," Poirot continued, "you placed Lydia in danger. You made her the next Celeste." "But she's not dead," Emmett said. "No," Poirot replied, "because the dose was not meant to kill. It was meant to scare. A warning." "To silence her," Miriam whispered. "Oui," Poirot said, "and it nearly worked." He turned to Lydia, now sitting weakly in the corner. "Madame, You came here under false pretenses. You are not Celeste's cousin." "No," she said softly. "I'm her sister." Another silence. "I changed my name years ago to escape the Rothborn scandal. I became a journalist. When Celeste wrote to me, before her death, saying she was ready to come forward, I knew I had to see it through." "Your article," Poirot said, "was nearly finished, yes?" She nodded. "But someone got to your notes," Poirot said. "They've been missing since the night before the first poisoning." She looked to Emmett. He hesitated. "I didn't steal them." "But you knew where they were," Poirot said, "and you told the general." "I didn't know. He'd kill her?" Poirot finished. "You may not have known the means, but you knew the danger." Miriam stood. "So what now?" Poirot took a breath. "Now, we finish the recipe." He walked to the writing desk, lifted a letter. Celeste left one final note, addressed not to her lawyer, not to her sister, but to me. It was slipped under my door last night. He read aloud, "If anything happens to me, know this. It wasn't only Alistair. He had help. Someone who benefited more than he did. Someone who watched me closer than anyone else. I thought she was my friend." Poirot turned to Miriam. Miriam shook her head. "No." "Yes," Poirot said. "You administered her tonic. You had access to her room, and you forged her signature on the last charity transfer. You were more than a physician, madame. You were a partner." Miriam stared at him, breath caught. "I discovered the matching handwriting from an old invoice in your medical files. Same loops, same pressure." Miriam stepped back. "He promised me a clinic. Said if I helped him keep it quiet. But you went too far," Poirot said. "You poisoned her tea the night before the dinner. The wine only sealed what the herbs had begun." Felix turned. "Then it wasn't just me." "No," Poirot said. "It never was. That is the tragedy. One sip, two motives, two killers, each believing the other would strike, each delivering just enough poison to wound. But together, it became fatal." The constables arrived. Miriam and Felix said nothing as they were led away. Poirot stood alone in the center of the room, eyes closed. Helena approached. "Is it truly over?" He did not answer immediately. Then, only when the truth has nowhere left to hide, she looked down at the flute on the tray. "One sip," she whispered. "That's all it took." Poirot replied quietly, "Oui." But it was never just the wine. It was the history that flavored it. And outside, for the first time, in days, the wind fell silent. Chapter 12. Death sat at the right hand. The chair was still warm when Poirot reached it. The fire had not gone out in the hearth, but the room was colder than it should have been. An untouched glass of port rested at the place setting, the napkin folded with military precision. Everything was in order, except for the fact that no one had sat at the head of the table. Instead, during the final dinner of this long and dreadful week, Helena Rothborn had asked Poirot himself to preside, and with unspoken consent, every guest had shifted one seat left. It was only when Poirot looked to his right, where death had quietly taken up residence before, that he realized what had been playing out since the very first night. "Always," he murmured, "always it sat at the right hand." The final hour had arrived, not with a scream or a gunshot, but with a question. It came from Lydia Tremaine, her voice rasping and ragged from the poison that had nearly ended her life the night before. "Why me?" she asked Poirot as he walked her through the corridor that once led to Celeste's room. "Why was I targeted last if the killers had already succeeded?" Poirot paused. then answered her in the dark. Because you carried the truth. And the truth, mademoiselle, is a more dangerous thing than vengeance. He left her resting in the care of the doctor, then descended into the belly of Belfort Manor once more, this time to the wine cellar, not for the wine, but for what lay behind it. The loose stone had already been discovered by a constable earlier that day, but Poirot had not shared it with the others yet. Behind the stone, a wooden box, old, rotting, lined with wax. Inside, documents, photographs, letters, every one of them bearing the same handwriting, and every one signed not by General Alistair Rothbourne, but by Emmett Lee. "Ah," Poirot said quietly, holding the final piece of the puzzle. "There you are." The evening gathered slowly around the long dining table, reduced now to 4 remaining guests. Miriam Hawthorne had been taken into custody. Felix Marlowe, too. The general was dead, but Emmett remained. So did Helena. And Lydia, weak but present, sat furthest from the candles, her eyes like dark moons, fixed on Poirot's every move. He stood only when the port had been poured. The room waited, afraid to breathe. "There is something sacramental about a dining table," Poirot said gently. "It is where we gather not only to eat, but to speak, to declare alliances, to betray. In this very room, every detail, every bite, every toast has pointed toward death, and always death has sat here, at the right hand of the host." His hand rested on the chair beside him. "The first to die sat here, Celeste Ward. The second nearly died here, Mademoiselle Tremaine. And always this seat has been prepared, watched, respected." He turned to Emmett. "You placed the guests. You advised the host. You arranged the seating, but never sat here yourself. Pourquoi, monsieur?" Emmett blinked. "I never thought—" "No," Poirot interrupted. "You thought quite a lot. You orchestrated the entire financial deception. You controlled the accounts. You framed Miriam. You manipulated Felix. But you never got your hands dirty. Until now." Poirot pulled the documents from his coat. "Letters. Orders. Every illicit transaction tied back to your hand. You were the architect, not the general. Rothbourne was your mask. And when Celeste discovered your true role, you panicked." Emmett's voice rose. "He gave the orders. I followed." Poirot nodded. "Until you gave one of your own. Kill her." Helena stood, slowly. "You, Emmett, all this time?" Poirot didn't flinch. He needed her gone, but not quickly, not visibly. A subtle poison, a suggestion of suicide. And when Lydia appeared, Emmett saw the shadow of the truth returning. So he attempted again. A smaller dose. "A message," Lydia whispered. "And the wine?" Poirot looked at her. The wine was to implicate Felix, and the herbs to implicate Miriam. A careful layering of blame. But Monsieur Emmett miscalculated one thing. He turned back to the table. "The chair. You always sat 2 places away from the host. Never here. Because you knew where the poison would be. You knew where it had to go. And tonight," Poirot slowly moved his own place card. "You made the same mistake again." Gasps rang out as Poirot lifted the final glass of port, the one placed beside him, and poured it into the silver bowl. The color darkened, fizzed. Poirot's voice was calm. "It reacts to saliva, a slow toxin. You dosed it before dinner began, but I changed the seating, quietly. You didn't notice." Emmett stood. "You can't prove. The bottle in the cellar has your fingerprints. The stone was loose. The ledger behind it bore your seal. Celeste found it. Lydia published it this morning. The newspapers have it now. Emmett's legs gave way. He fell back into the very seat he had once reserved for others, the chair of death. Poirot stood in silence. Lydia placed a shaking hand on the table. "So it ends." "Non," Poirot said. "It concludes." He turned to Helena. "You have lost much, but you did not kill." She shook her head, tears forming. Poirot looked once more to Emmett, now held by two constables. "Death," he said softly, "sits at the right hand of pride. And pride, monsieur, is a dangerous guest to serve." Outside, the storm had passed, but the silence within the manor was deeper now, not fearful, not expectant, just full of what had been left behind. Poirot stepped into the hall, placing his gloves in his pocket. Lydia followed a step behind. She said, "You always knew, didn't you?" Poirot's smile was brief. "Non, I suspected, then I observed, and then finally, I listened." "To what?" He looked up the staircase, where Celeste's portrait still hung. "To the dead." And with that, Hercule Poirot left the dining hall of Belfort Manor, for the last time, where death had sat quietly, politely, and always beside power.